So this chicken walks into a library, presumably to the horror section, since we are recounting the tale on a horror channel after all. And the librarian walks up to the chicken and asks, "Can I help you?" The chicken says, "Book, book, book." The librarian suggests a book, and the chicken happily leaves. The next day, the chicken returns the tome, again says, "Book, book, book," and the librarian provides a different volume. The chicken seems happy once again and leaves, but again comes back the next day and once again says, "Book, book, book." The librarian again provides some reading material, but is now starting to get curious and so follows the chicken out of the library. The chicken carries the book across town to a pond, and the librarian watches as the bird presents the book to a frog sitting there on a lily pad. But the frog just shakes his head and says, "Read it, read it." Well, here we are, embarking upon another month, and so, even though I'm amazed at how quickly the time has flown, it's now time for another of my monthly book review videos. I guess February is the shortest month of the year, so it's not just that I'm losing all sense of time, but here we are whether we like it or not. Anyway, if you're new to this channel, we talk about horror all the time here, and one of the ways we do that is in these monthly book review videos. And I think I do have some good recommendations for you this month, so be sure to stay tuned. If you happen to find any of these books I'll be discussing interesting, I'll have purchase links for you right down there in the What's It, so you can support my work here on this channel while at the same time picking up some great and wonderful reading material for yourself. Do be sure also, while you're at it, to like, share, subscribe, and ring my bell. It is all very much appreciated. But what we're really here to discuss are these books themselves, and as I said, I have a pretty good selection to talk about this month. Mostly they're horror novels, though as regular viewers know, I do have eclectic tastes, so I've thrown in a couple extra ones just for fun. But jumping right in, the first book I read in February was indeed a horror novel, and that was this Cretaceous Canyon by Deborah Sheldon. With a title like Cretaceous Canyon and a picture of a rather terrifying looking dinosaur on the front cover, I think we all know what we're in for with this book. It's a kind of Jurassic Park style book, though certainly not merely a ripoff of its better-known cousin. In this one, a group of people are hired to go on a hike in a remote and uncharted Australian canyon where someone seems to have discovered an extant tree that bears striking resemblance to one from the Cretaceous period, and of course, thus thought long extinct. Well, this being a horror novel, it turns out they were entirely correct, but that's not the only thing from the Cretaceous in that canyon, and now our group of heroes find themselves facing off against an eclectic group of prehistoric predators. One thing I liked is that the dinosaurs featured in this book aren't just velociraptors and T-Rexes. They're just as effective and probably just as frightening as those famous dinosaurs, but it was nice to see a dinosaur horror novel slightly expand upon the pool of dinosaurs worth reading about. After all, there were at least 1,000 and possibly as many as 2,500 or so different species of dinosaur. We've described about 1,000, and scientists have estimated a range up to about 2,500 as the actual number of distinct species. And about half of those did in fact live during the Cretaceous period, and so the author had quite an eclectic group from which to draw, and she did so with care, featuring not only the kinds of carnivorous predators we'd expect in a horror novel, but even some distinct dangers offered by herbivorous beasts that simply were never meant to interact with human beings. From that point, the novel does go pretty much as one would expect it to. There are no great twists or surprises here, but I don't think this book needs them. All we really need is to take an interesting cast of characters and place them in a world full of dinosaurs. And that's exactly what we get on both points. As for the characters themselves, I will admit that the novel starts off by introducing a pretty large cast of characters in rapid succession in the first couple of chapters, and it took me a little while to start to recognize who was who and who was where and what was what and everything that was going on. And as such, it also took me a little while to really get into the novel. But once it finds its stride, a little shy of halfway through, maybe a third of the way through, it does end up being a real page-turner. My next two books are the most non-horror offerings for the month, so even though I think there's some interesting stuff here, let's go ahead and get these out of the way so we can return to our favorite genre to finish up toward the end of the video. The first of those, I suppose, one might classify as either a horror story or a tale of triumphant victory, depending on one's own political point of view, because it happens to be a sort of political history. The book is called The Blueprint: How the Democrats Won Colorado and Why Republicans Everywhere Should Care, by Adam Schrager and Rob Witwer. Obviously, I, like most readers, have my own political views, but I'm going to keep them out of my review here, and that's reasonable and appropriate to do, not only because this is a horror channel and we shouldn't be arguing about politics, but also because the authors of this political history also themselves did a remarkable job of keeping their own political views out of their book. Throughout its pages, the book quotes, and indeed is ultimately praised by, Democrats and Republicans alike. Rather than arguing which side the reader should take, the book instead presents a history, a rather unbiased, just the facts sort of history, of how Colorado, once a Republican stronghold, then for a while a sort of purple state for a period of, a decade or two, ultimately, in recent years, became one of the most reliably Democratic states in the country. And it wasn't just shifting demographics, nor was it that the voters all changed their minds because they read arguments that convinced them to switch parties or anything like that. It was a specific set of campaign activities chronicled in detail within these pages. Why should we care enough to read a book like this? Well, if one happens to be a Democrat, I suspect one would probably like to learn how the party essentially took control of what everyone thought was a reliably red to purple state of Colorado, so the same strategy could be adapted to other states. And if one is, on the other hand, a Republican, one probably wants to understand enough to prevent the same kind of strategy from being used again in other states, or, in fact, to adapt it to support more conservative causes. Regardless of ideology, though, I think we all ought to take an interest in our history, and that includes, in fact, such recent history as this. As to the quality of the book, I can't really complain about anything. It's well written, engaging, and impressively well researched. It really does tell, essentially, the whole story of Colorado's political shift a couple decades ago. The only caveat I'd add is that the book was published some 15 years ago and has not been updated with a second edition. So while it's correct and accurate as far as it goes, political scholars wondering about developments after 2010 will have to find other sources. Nevertheless, I'd consider this something of a must-read book, particularly but not exclusively for those of us in Colorado. The next book is much more fun, however, and that's The Food Lab by J. Kenji Lopez-Alt. This massive tome, which in fact I'm going to set here so I don't have to give myself a workout holding this beast of a book up, this massive tome promises, according to its subtitle, better home cooking through science. And honestly, that's exactly what it delivers. This is not your run-of-the-mill cookbook that provides a couple hundred recipes with only the most basic instruction in technique, sort of as a framing device or an introductory chapter. No, this is a book about technique, which happens to also include some recipes to illustrate the points. If you really want to learn how to cook, this would be one of the best books you can get. Let me start with a couple things this book isn't. As I already mentioned, it's not primarily a book of recipes, though it does have plenty within its pages. It's also not fundamentally a book to teach you how to cook, though it does include instructions on technique. If you're looking for either recipes or for step-by-step how to do each of the things that you need to do in the kitchen, hundreds of other authors will have you covered. What this book does contain, and what really sets it apart from all the rest, is the kind of knowledge that can transform the techniques and the recipes that you already know and might already use every day into something much greater. Trained in science and engineering even before learning to cook, the author subjects recipes and common kitchen wisdom and just ideas of what to do in the kitchen to rigorous testing, and often determines that, quote-unquote, because we've always done it this way, is not really a good enough reason to continue a practice. Want to avoid a dry chicken breast, for example? The author takes the time to explain exactly where those government temperature guidelines come from, and suggests very easy, simple techniques you can use to safely enjoy poultry without cooking every last vestige of moisture out of it, as so many people seem to do in their home kitchens. What you'll discover as you read this book is that most of the recipes included to illustrate the various techniques look delicious indeed. There's good recipes in here. But even more importantly than following these recipes, you'll start to rethink your approach to your own recipes, and even to invent some new ones for yourself. Just about every page sparked some kind of idea in my mind as I was reading it, and in fact, if you pick up this book, you might want to read this one with a notebook readily at hand so you can jot down ideas as they come to you while you're reading. That was a very frequent occurrence while I was going through this book. What's more, it's all presented in an often humorous, conversational tone of voice. The author doesn't shy away from getting into the weeds about real science, but presents it in a way that even the non-scientist and even the not particularly scientifically inclined reader should not struggle to understand what the author's talking about. I hesitate to say this is the best cookbook I've ever read. That's fairly subjective, and different cookbooks excel at different things. Some are great recipe books, some are great technique books, some are great novelty books, and so forth. But I do think this is one of the best, and one that's undoubtedly done the most for my ability to create, modify, and execute original dishes in my own home kitchen. And I seem not to be the only one who thinks so. The book has quite deservedly won numerous prestigious awards, as indicated here on the cover. And just as an interesting side note, I noticed while reading some other reviews online that most of the book's positive reviews talk about the science, the techniques, the recipes, the subject matter of the book, while the very few negative reviews I could find seemed to miss the point entirely and focus only on the author's sense of humor. De gustibus non est disputandum, I suppose. Our next book this month is generally not considered a horror novel per se, though it does have some thematic similarities with the genre. It will be the last that it's even questionable. The others will be horror. This one's sort of a borderline one. And the book is The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. No relation as far as I know, but wouldn't that be a cool thing to find in my family tree? But I digress. Though I'm primarily a horror fan, and this isn't your typical horror novel, I actually think it does belong to the genre for its ability to paint a sort of existential horror, particularly in its final chapter, in which the demon Screwtape proposes a toast at a feast of demons, attributing essentially all of the current state of man to diabolic influence. Whether one is a religious reader or not, it's difficult to read such a chapter without walking away despairing of the number of quote-unquote failed humans, to use Screwtape's own terminology, running around in the world around us. In terms of actually reviewing this book for quality, though, there's little one can say except to marvel at the genius of what I personally think is C.S. Lewis's finest work. Many will disagree with me on that point, but that's my own opinion, at least based on the number of his works I've read so far. I've read several, but not quite all of them. The real genius of what he accomplished was his ability to create a work that's intellectually and morally challenging. In fact, seldom a page goes by in which the reader isn't given cause to put the book aside for a moment and reflect upon some deep thought. And yet, it's also not at all challenging to read. Screwtape's relatively light and almost cheerful tone, at least light and cheerful for a devil anyway, belies the importance of the subject matter. And that combination results in a book that, if I may be forgiven the cliché, is nearly impossible to put down. Fortunately, for the rest of my schedule, it's a relatively short book, so my inability to put it down didn't entirely hamper my work. But every time I read it, I'm left wishing it were 10 times its length, because I just can't get enough. This satiric collection of letters from the demon Screwtape to his somewhat bumbling nephew Wormwood is as timely and relevant today as it was when it first appeared more than 8 decades ago during the height of the Second World War. Most Christians are likely already quite familiar with it, but even the non-Christian, indeed even the non-religious of any sort of reader, stands to gain a lot from the wisdom contained herein. And just as a special side note of relevance primarily to horror fans, I'd also refer fans of this novel to the movie called Nefarious that came out a couple of years ago, and vice versa. That one, the movie, is more firmly established within our favorite genre, but covers similar topics with a more contemporary twist. Not that it can stand up to the Screwtape letters, of course, but still worth a watch, and the book, of course, very much worth a read. Next, and finally returning more firmly to the horror genre, I finished up the month by revisiting some real classics of the genre. First among those was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Honestly, if I have to describe to you the plot or try to review Frankenstein for you, I don't really know what to think. If you don't know this one, you might be on the wrong channel. Not that you should switch off by any means. I appreciate every viewer I get, but I suspect all of you probably know this story backward and forward. What I will say, in lieu of a complete review, though, is that if you've only ever seen the movie adaptations of Frankenstein, you haven't really understood Frankenstein. Don't get me wrong, the movies are great, but only a couple of them even tried to stay true to the novel. Kenneth Branagh's came relatively close, for instance, but the most popular ones, like the Universal films, are only loosely inspired by the book. And that's a shame, because Shelley's novel offers great richness of opportunity for literary interpretation and conveyance of wisdom. I used to know a literature professor, in fact, who would ask a question about the character of Igor on final exams to determine whether students had actually read the book or only watched one of the movies. But even among those who have read the book, possibilities for interpretation are vast indeed. It lends itself to a lot of different thoughts about science, religion, morality, relationships, and so much more. I even read one paper back in the day that tried to call it a lesbian allegory, although I can't possibly imagine what that particular critic was thinking about. Though I suppose one could take it as a criticism of excluding women from the world, or a world without women, because though there are, of course, female characters in the book, the crux of the novel involves a creation of life without feminine input or participation, and things end up not working out so well. So that is, in that sense, a possible interpretation. But put that aside and consider the old trope I've seen on the internet, which says, knowledge is knowing Frankenstein isn't the monster, but wisdom is recognizing that he is. But is he? Is he the monster? Or is the monster the monster? Who's the actual villain here? The monster is not evil by nature, but racks up quite the body count, including of innocent people. Frankenstein never directly harms anyone, but his hubris created a tortured being, tortured all the more because his own creator, his father, if you will, refused to claim him as his own and left the poor wretch to fend for himself. If you're looking for black and white ideas of monstrousness, you won't find it here. Instead, you'll find subtlety and thought-provoking studies in ambiguity. I'll leave Frankenstein for today with the thought that many people consider it the first science fiction novel. I don't agree, but that's not to take anything away from Shelley's accomplishment in this novel. For one thing, I think there are earlier works that are at least arguably more deserving of the title of first sci-fi novel. But more importantly for me, though there are certainly science fiction elements in Frankenstein, I just don't think it quite fits my own internal definition of what constitutes science fiction. I consider it much more belonging to the horror genre, but I suppose at the end of the day, genres are just marketing labels anyway, and the most important thing is that we should all read great literature, and Frankenstein certainly is that. Finally, I finished up the month with The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. It's another one I think probably most of my viewers are already familiar with, so I can probably be brief here in my remarks as well. If you haven't read it yet, you really should. But if you happen to have seen Mike Flanagan's The Haunting of Bly Manor, that is a reasonably faithful adaptation of the novel, at least as far as it goes, and a pretty good series in its own right. But as for the novel, I do consider this to be one of the finest classics of ghost fiction. It deals with some of my favorite themes involving ambiguity. Are the ghostly happenings real or merely psychological, for instance? These are the kinds of questions I think the finest Gothic literature ought to deal with, and this one combines those themes of ambiguity with additional ideas to do with the moral corruption of seemingly innocent children, which is always a delightful thing to read about, I suppose. I once heard a classic described as a book that shows you something new every time you read it. And The Turn of the Screw, short as it is, easily meets that criterion. If you're just looking for a great ghost story, it absolutely is that, and you'll be happy with it. But if you're looking for something deeper, it will aptly reward as deep a reading as you want to give it. And that, my friends, brings us once again to the close of yet another video. I seem to have found a good and interesting mix of books this month with, I think, quite an eclectic range in both subject matter and in length, as evidenced by these ones. But of course, I'm already underway with my reading for March, so be sure to subscribe and stick around for that, and indeed for all the other videos I have planned. But until then, take care and stay scared.